I used to think perception was easy to explain. I perceive a glass of water, so I go and pick it up and drink the water. But when I started asking more questions, everyday actions like picking up a glass of water aren't that simple to explain. In this video, I want to discuss why perception science is more complex than just seeing something and doing a thing. But first, because there are so many views and ideas about perception science, I'll be using what's called a false dichotomy throughout this and other videos. Imagine I asked if your favourite football team was Chelsea or Manchester City, but you were a Liverpool fan. The question isn't fair. I only gave you two options despite there being way more teams. It's the same situation here. The ecological approach is what I follow, the team I support. But I will group all of the others as the traditional approach for simplicity. Traditional approaches do differ, so there are different teams, but they all differ from the ecological approach enough to group them all together. Yes, the amount of difference can and probably will be discussed in future videos. But for now, let's get into the nature of knowledge. To do anything, we need knowledge and understanding of the world around us. But where does the knowledge come from? How do we understand our world to perform actions, like picking up a glass? Do we understand our world accurately? Does our perception of the world match the real world? Descartes in 1637 used introspection to try and answer these questions, thinking inwards about himself. If I look at my camera in front of me, I have a belief that it exists. Information from my senses have helped me form that belief. But if my senses can't be trusted, then the existence of the camera is in question. If the source of knowledge is in doubt, then objects' existence and the world's existence can be in doubt as well. Descartes famously said, "Cogito ergo sum." I think, therefore I am. The act of thinking didn't make him exist, but the doubt of his own existence must have come from somewhere. Thus, he must exist. But everything else was open to question, including his body. We have moved on since then, understanding neurons, brain signals, and loads of other things. Modern science suggesting our nervous system is where thoughts and feelings come from. But for those of you that have seen The Matrix, can something like machines be tapping into our nervous system, creating a false world? You might and probably will say no. But some people believe only our minds exists and everything else is a trick played on the mind, not necessarily by machines. And this view is called solipsism, which leaves us with a decision. Either believe the world exists, realism, or only our mind exists, solipsism. What's interesting here is that there's no real proof of either view. We would need to escape the matrix to find out. So we need to make an assumption. Assumptions are things we hold true without proof because we can't get evidence, like in this example. However, if the world doesn't exist, there is no real point figuring out how we function in it, and we can't really trust our findings either. Whereas with realism, we are confirming there is something, and we aren't in the matrix. But some assumptions can be held for so long they feel like fact, and that undoing them would make too many changes and challenge too many ways of thinking. Ecological psychology challenges some of these long-held assumptions and ways of thinking. The majority of sciences and people who talk about the world assume it exists. Realism, which is the first assumption in perception science. But how do we gain knowledge about the world? Some people have suggested we are born with knowledge, passed down by past generations. Other people have suggested knowledge is stored in our DNA. However, empiricists Locke and Aristotle suggested we learn from our experiences. But this has two parts. Firstly, we start with no knowledge, a blank slate called the tabula rasa. So when we are born, we don't have any knowledge and we gain knowledge from our experiences. But our experiences are all sensory. We gain knowledge from our senses. And that is the second assumption in perception science. We are born with no knowledge and gain knowledge through our senses. However, just like Descartes asked decades before, if we gain knowledge through the senses, How can we know they are reliable? Does the world inside of our head match the outside world? How do we know if the world does or doesn't resemble what we have inside of our head? If what is in our head doesn't match the outside world, then we have a similar problem as with solipsism. A mind and a world that may or may not exist the way that we experience it, or what we have inside of our head does match the outside world, then we get a third assumption. Senses somehow inform us about the world. However, this is where science is still stuck, because we don't really know how this works, but we do know it must. Now, science looks to find causes. Why did something happen in that way? What caused that result over another result? When someone has an idea or hypothesis, it is put forward to be tested. The result then gives us information about what might be the cause. But a cause can be far more complex than you might think. Take a white pool ball knocking the black 8 ball into a pocket. What caused the ball to go in? 1. Materials of or around the objects could have changed, causing the ball to go in, a material cause. 2. The game of pool is to pot the black 8 ball at the end, so the game rules could be a cause, a final cause. 3. The game designer made it possible for the ball to go into the pocket, a formal cause. 4. The player hit the white ball with a pool cue to hit the black ball into the pocket, an efficient cause. 5. God wanted the black ball to go in, so it did, a metaphysical cause. 6. Maybe someone was watching the Snooker World Championships and was inspired to play on their pool table, a psychosocial cause. Something I do. Then 7. The invisible mind-reading gnomes that live on the pool table read the player's mind and pot the black ball for them, a gnomic cause. Now, cause 7 is just made-up nonsense, but not entirely illogical. It is impossible to disprove the cause, so can't be tested by science, whereas cause 4, where the player pots the ball, is probably what you would say is the main cause. It feels the most logical, as it lines up best with modern science and thinking, but it's not necessarily the most logical. Without some of the other possible causes, the player may not have tried to pot the ball in the first place. But the efficient cause is what science often focuses on, also known as local causality. In this case, the pool cue hits the white ball hits the black ball, and the black ball goes into the pocket. All objects in direct contact, which is an assumption used in modern science. All causality must be local. But there is an obvious issue with this. I can move up to the glass before I have touched the glass. There is an action at a distance problem. When I see something, I don't always have contact with the object. The glass or any object would be the cause of my action, but as I don't touch it until the end of the first action, there must be something helping me. A thing in the middle giving me indirect contact with the glass. As you might think, there are a few different ideas out there, but they are all very similar in that there is essentially a copy of the world. The copy of the world, like the glass, contacts the person, me, not the original object. So we assume contact is mediated, helped by a copy. But how do we get a copy into our head, and how does the copy inform us about the world? Through modern science, we know light travels in straight lines. We also know our eyes have light receptors at the back. So light shines from a light source, like the sun or a light, and then travels in straight lines to our eyes. But after looking at people's eyes, we can see the light makes an image known as a retinal image. This image is upside down, left to right, and also in 2D. It's like the screen at a cinema. So that might be how we get the copy through vision, but there is a huge problem. We don't see upside down, right to left, or in 2D. Our experience is very different, and there is also no meaning attached to this image yet. So how can this inform us about the world? This stimulation needs to be turned into perception. We assume the copy is delivered to the brain, but is bad and needs fixing. This bad stimulation or bad copy is often referred to as an impoverished stimulus. Essentially, the incoming copy, stimulus, is poor, impoverished. Hopefully it is obvious why it needs fixing, but let's take distance as an example. If the retinal image is 2D, then distance doesn't exist. But hold on, we can see 2D photos in 3D, right? No. Looking at these trees, they look the same size and arguably the same distance away, but one is actually much farther away. How can we know which is farther away? In the real world, this is important, as a real tree, farther away, could have food on, like an apple, which we can eat, whereas a small tree, closer, could be a fake model that shouldn't be eaten. Then how can we know when the tree starts and ends? Colour contrast is something we could use, but it isn't always obvious. When you add colour blindness as well, the beginning and end of objects gets even harder. Then some shapes can create the same image, like a cone or a ball. It depends on the orientation. However, we don't make these mistakes, so we must have solved these issues somehow. But knowing the size of one tree isn't the same as any other tree. We can't rely on knowledge after experiencing a tree once. There must be something else going on. Helmholtz has the most influential suggestion to solve these problems. He said the flat retinal image, yes, is bad and needs fixing, but is still useful. It just needs a little bit of help. The size, shape, start and stop of objects can be inferred from cues and rules, learned as children, then applying them based on ongoing experience. Rules like if the bottom of an object is higher, it is further away. If the bottom of an object is lower, then the object is closer. Then other rules like if the object is in front of another, they are closer. If an object is hidden by another, it must be further away. Helmholtz suggested we aren't consciously aware or putting conscious effort into this interpretation, and we can't control this interpretation either. Our mind identifies the cues and rules we learn and unconsciously infers for us, for our own understanding. So cues plus rules plus unconscious inference equals understanding. The inference that happens is helped by the most likely situation, often termed the principle of maximum likelihood. If it was A 3 times before, it is most likely an A, not a B. These calculations result in a mental representation. The only debate now is what rules and cues do we use? As someone who lost much of their sight in the right eye in 2020, I don't have the usual well-functioning 2 eyes, but most people do. One example cue could use the distance between the eyes as it won't change and is unconsciously known. The angle to the objects from both eyes also, presumably, would be unconsciously known, which means we could, unconsciously, use trigonometry to figure out the distance. But that is a bit much for every object we see, and arguments were made that absolute distance is less important than relative distance to other objects. We don't need the meters away, rather, is that closer than something else? Then a different cue could be that with closer objects you need to move both eyes inwards towards the nose more. The retina also changes, which also happens by muscles in the eye. So the cue, movement of our ocular motor muscles, may help with depth. Or a different cue might be that where our eyes are looking. Both eyes will have slightly different positions known as binocular disparity. Closer objects have greater difference or disparity, and the disparity will still be there with far away objects. They are just 3 potential cues for understanding depth, but the assumption is that there is unconscious inference used to fix the bad copy. What is important here is that this separates us from the mental representation. The copy that is created by this unconscious inference is different from us. We can't control the unconscious inference, which creates a separation or dualism of the organism, us, and the environment, everything else. I don't have access to the world or the stimulation from my senses. I only have access to the unconscious interpretation or mental representation of the fixed copy. When I'm asked about my knowledge of the world, it is really my knowledge of my representation of the world. So we assume my experience is based on an internally constructed representation of the world, not the stimulation that led to the representation. These 8 assumptions all build traditional approaches to perception. Although there is debate, other modern approaches like connectionism and Bayesian modelling rest on the same assumptions. But what if, maybe, these assumptions often deemed as fact are actually inaccurate? And so some of the problems we face due to these assumptions aren't really problems. That is what ecological psychology does. It rethinks some of these assumptions and challenges old ways of thinking. In this video, I talk more about the book Introduction to Ecological Psychology, which is the main source for this video.